It feels like it's been about 10 years since I made the first video about my drawing project, and I finally decided to make a second one. My next step after implementing panning was to create an ability to zoom in and out on a drawing. The simplest way to do it was to just add a new prop called zoom and then scale the points of the drawing according to its value. And by scaling a point, I mean just multiplying its coordinates by some value. This way we can have a slider to control the size of the drawing. It kinda worked, though obviously that wasn't enough. But before going further, I wanted to change the way we look at things. At that point I had two variables for panning and zooming, and I wanted something more generic. So here is what I did. Let's say this is our drawing, but instead of moving it and changing its size, we'll pretend that we're making a movie or something, and we have a camera with a viewport. So when we zoom in, it's the viewport that's getting smaller, and when we pan, it is what actually moves. To implement that, I created a new interface for the viewport, which is just a rectangle with a size and coordinates. Then I passed it into the canvas instead of pan and zoom props, made a couple of functions to find the coordinates of a point on the viewport, and applied them to the drawing before every render. And I also had to do the reverse process when I handled the user's input. Then I could just update the viewport when a user panned or zoomed, and the result was the same as before. After that, I needed to fix a couple of small things. The first one was that when I zoomed in, it kinda focused on the top level corner of the viewport, and I wanted to zoom in on the center. To do that, I needed to keep track of the last zoom value. I used the ref for it, and then every time zoom updated, I calculated a new viewport based on the difference between the current zoom and the previous one. Perfect. The other thing was, when I panned the painting while zoomed in, it moved way faster than I wanted. To fix that, I just needed to adjust the coordinates when panning according to the ratio between the viewport size and the painting size. The next step was to add a shortcut to zoom. I wanted the zoom value to change on pressing the Ctrl key and using the mouse wheel. Listening on the mouse wheel movement and React is a bit tricky. I couldn't just use the onWheel property of the canvas. The reason for that is this. Basically, you can mark an event listener as passive. Passive events don't wait for the custom event handlers and execute the default behavior right away. Usually it leads to a smoother user experience, but the drawback is that we cannot use the prevent default method for those events. And here is the problem. Some of the React events are passive by default, so if I used the onWheel property, I couldn't have prevented the default behavior and the page would have scrolled every time I tried to zoom in or out on the painting. That meant I had to go old school and use the add-remove event listener methods in a useEffect hook. Note that if the Ctrl key is pressed, I prevented scrolling and called the onUserZoom callback. Inside of that callback, I just added some number to the zoom value. Another thing I did was I updated lines width based on the zoom, so that they become more thick when you zoom in. Soon I realized that the ability to zoom was too powerful, so I had to implement a minimum and a maximum values. Then I noticed that when zoomed in, the panning limits didn't work properly. The fix was to use the viewport size in the calculations as well. The next annoying thing was that I could draw lines, but I couldn't draw dots by just clicking on the board. That was because a single click just invoked this handle user start drawing callback, and all it did was to add an empty line to the sketch, because I assumed that it will be immediately followed by the handle user draw callback that will add segments to that line, but it doesn't happen on a single click. So I had to also process the event when a user finishes drawing, which basically happens on mouse up, and then here, if the current line was empty, I added a dot segment to it. And then I could draw dots, which is extremely helpful if you need 3 of them. After that I decided to do a bit of refactoring. Right then that SketchBoard canvas component was pretty big, and most of it was just mouse handling logic. So I decided to extract it into a separate hook like this. We pass a reference to a canvas and a bunch of high-level callbacks into it, and it manages all the internal logic inside. And then the component looked much cleaner. Then I noticed another bug. If you hold the mouse button, move it outside the board, unpress the button and move the mouse back, it's gonna keep drawing. That happened because I only listened to mouse up events inside the board. To fix it, I added this check to the mouse move handler. If a button wasn't pressed, I updated the internal mouse state structure. At that point I noticed that I didn't have ESLint installed, so I added it, fixed a couple of errors. They were mostly about missing hook dependencies. Like in this case, the dependency array is missing the viewport variable, because we use it inside of the function. So I just added it to the array. What an easy fix, right? Nope. Now I had this error basically telling me I had an infinite loop in the code. And if you look closer, you'll see why. So I added the viewport to the dependencies, but I also called the setViewport function here. That meant every time the viewport updated, the effect ran, and every time the effect ran, it updated the viewport. There are multiple ways to deal with situations like these. Sometimes it indicates flaws in your logic and you need to restructure your code. Thankfully, in this case, there was an easy fix to get rid of the error. Instead of using the basic set function, I used the one with the callback as a parameter. And since the old viewport was passed into it, I could remove it from the dependencies. And just like that, the error was gone. Unfortunately, at that point it was almost past my bedtime, so I decided that was enough for in the second video. In the next one we'll deal with the touchscreen support and hopefully work on the performance. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you there.